From the early 16th century, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. It was the Ottoman Sultan, who was known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem as we see them today. At its zenith, the Islamic Ottoman Empire dominated the whole of southeastern Europe, as well as much of North Africa and the Middle East. However, by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was well in decline and had become dependent on trade with European powers such as France, Germany and Great Britain, and also Russia for its economic survival. With this economic dependence came increasing influence by the European powers, especially when it came to the treatment of non-Turkish, non-Muslim minorities within the Ottoman Empire.
Britain in 1839 began to establish a diplomatic relationship with the Turks, and this was part of a process of reforms in the 1800s called the Tanzimat. Very, very important to understand this, because the Tanzimat basically gave to the European powers certain conditions. It was already there from the capitulations, but now the Europeans were saying, we want more autonomy for the minority groups. Now, under Islam, the minority groups were known as the dhimmi subjects, whether they were Christians of various denominations and Jewish people, Armenians, for instance, under Islam, and the Jewish people at the bottom of the ladder.
Remember, the Ottomans were an empire. Empire built for many people, different everywhere. If they give any kind of autonomy, independence to one people, then the others would come and demand it. To say the Ottomans were not treating the Jewish people very well, they didn't treat anybody very well, as a matter of fact.
Great Britain was the first Western nation to establish a consulate in Jerusalem. The reason given for their presence here was for the protection of the Jewish people, which by the 1840s was the largest single ethnic group in Jerusalem. For many years, in the mid-19th century, the British consulate was located adjacent to the first Protestant church to be established in the Middle East, right here within the Christ Church compound inside the Jaffa Gate. Today, what was the consul's residence and office is the Christ Church Rectory. It was also here at Christ Church in 1865 that the Palestine Exploration Fund, under the patronage of Queen Victoria, established its Middle East headquarters.
In the 1870s, at the beginning of the 1870s, it was decided that a proper map of Palestine of that time, or the Holy Land, needed to be made. So the end result of this project, which lasted from 1871 all the way through to 1878, was that you had this map of the entire country, 1 inch to the scale. You also had a set of memoirs listing all of the archaeological sites which were visited and with the discoveries which were made there. But also they provided a lot of information about the land as a whole, in terms of, for instance, those areas where you had forests, those areas which were utilized for agricultural purposes. Also in terms of the population of the time, they really provided us with a very detailed picture of the demography of the land, who lived there, and what were the differences in terms of those inhabitants within given villages and towns, Christians, Muslim and Jews. And I think this is very important in terms of our understanding of what the land looked like, its general appearance, and who were living in that land in the 1870s.
Before the Mandate, these were all countries living under the Ottoman rule, this Turkish rule. People are just holding land that is actually owned by Turkish landlords.
Lands here were centered in late 19th century in hands of big effendis. Almost all the villages there were neglected. They were almost uninhabited villages. And if they were inhabited, they were around the valley, not in the valley itself, and very small very, very neglected villages.
If you look at the historical evidence, they are very poor countries. They are very unsuccessful. They are very underpopulated. This is particularly true of parts of southern Syria. Deeply underpopulated. They're not glamorous, wonderful, happy places at all.
If we talk about the whole population in Eretz Israel, 1800 about, estimation 200,000, 1830 250,000, 1905 500,000, WW1 600,000, perhaps 650. 1922, the first Mandat census, 673. These are the numbers, not more than that.
Looking at Jerusalem, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were, let's say, about 2,000 Jews in Jerusalem. We can see that by the 1840s, the Jews in Jerusalem was already a majority congregation in the city, because there was about 4,000 Jews and 3,000 Muslims and 2,500 Christians. All the population of Jerusalem were living within the city walls.
For over 20 centuries, the city of Jerusalem was almost completely composed of or limited to the old city. If you look at Jerusalem in the 1st century and the 5th century, all the way up to the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city. There was very little outside the walls.
In 1863, British consul James Finn, who was living here inside the Jaffa Gate, conducted a census of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The figures were published the following year. Out of a total population of 15,000, 8,000 were Jewish. The other 7,000 were made up of Muslims and Christians. So by then, Jerusalem had a Jewish majority population. In the mid-19th century, Jewish philanthropist Sir Moses Montefiore was given permission to purchase land outside the city walls, which paved the way for the expansion of the city of Jerusalem.
The cornerstone for Mishkenot Sha'ananim was laid in 1851, and it was in 1853 that Montefiore actually imported the windmill here. In Mishkenot Sha'ananim, the construction was completed in 1861.
And we have neighborhoods, straight after Mishkenot Sha'ananim and Machane Israel. We find Nachalat Shiva in 1869, and Beit David in 1873, and Mea Sharim 1874. But really the push leaving the old city walls was really, I would say, the pushing forces that started to create this movement.
So to sum up, the city of Jerusalem up to the mid-19th century was contained entirely within the city walls. There was no West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem in those days. There had been a resident Jewish community continually here since the Middle Ages at least. And by the 1860s, the historic records show the overall majority of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish. When you look at the eyewitness accounts of people who travelled to the Holy Land in the 19th century, they speak of a land that was both desolate and sparsely populated. The surveys undertaken by the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1870s confirm that. There is absolutely no historic record of an Arab people who called themselves the Palestinians, let alone a Palestinian Arab entity whose capital city was Jerusalem. Palestine then was not a nation or even a state. It was an area of the Ottoman Empire ruled from Constantinople, also known as the province of southern Syria. Yes, it is true that the majority of Western Palestine's sparse population was ethnically Arab, many of whose ancestors originally came here with the Islamic occupation that began in the 7th century AD. But the historic fact is that the territory known as Palestine has never, since the name Palestine was first applied by the Romans, been an Arab nation or designated to be an Arab nation. In other words, historically, an Arab nation known as Palestine never existed.
I think that the study of history, I would say this as an historian, wouldn't I? But nonetheless, I think the study of history is tremendously important when it comes to the understanding of why Israel is Israel. If we were taught a bit more about the Ottoman Empire, a bit more about the rise of nationhood and nationalism, a bit more about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the whole of the creation of the idea of the State of Israel after the First World War as well as before it, people would understand that this isn't a 1947, 1948 construct at all.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we look at the birth of the Zionist movement and the Balfour Declaration.